welcome back everybody. Glad we made it out here in the lovely weather that we're having. Got through 90 degrees and now we have 9 inches of rain it seems. Anyways, so this meeting we're picking up where we kind of left off at the public information meeting that was held last week. It was the first one for part of this project. It was, obviously we know the intention was to give the community an opportunity to come out and express concerns, recommendations, questions about the comprehensive plan and where it's going for its 2020 update based on the one that's been active since 2010. And well, the real goal of this meeting was, from our standpoint as staff, was for everyone who got to attend and watch the video of it since the meeting. We wanted to be able to answer any questions you had from those comments that were generated and how they may apply to this document that we're going to get started on later this fall. So I really want to open the floor to you guys to ask us questions about things you've heard, observed, things that kind of struck an interest in you about what some of those comments were and how they might impact this plan, and can we address them or can we not, or is there a recommendation you want to build on, things like that, kind of what we've been looking for this entire process. So I'll open up to you guys and ask away.
Were there additional comments received online that we haven't seen yet?
There have been, I think the number is currently 7 right now. We have 7 comments that have come in, but we're waiting until the October 11th deadline to gather all those all at once, along with anything that comes in through planning@penfield.org or any mailed letters or comments. Until we're waiting for everything to come in so we can give it to you all at one time, and then we can respond to that and review it at the meeting after that one.
I had a couple questions, Ed.
Go for it.
One of the things that I guess what I took away from the meeting was that there was a lot of people that were concerned about some of the larger development projects taking over what they thought of was the historical value, the peacefulness part of town. Seemed like nobody was there saying, please bring us more big projects. They seemed like they were asking for more creative but smaller projects.
Yeah, and I think you're referring to the Empire Boulevard project.
Well, that
and
I brought my wrong notebook, but from my memory was that almost everybody did talk about the mixed-use projects that are kind of stalled right now, and thinking that was a large
well,
scale.
and it's not a bad comment, but the thing you got to take into account is the fact that these mixed-use districts require developers to do a lot more than what a normal development would occur. And when you start requiring amenities like long walking paths and different types of things,
Or you limit the number of units, or you require massive open space numbers.
you are taking a lot of the.
Well, I was just trying to go over my
Yeah, and
not whether you're
and
trying
I'm
to
glad
wrong,
you did.
but
It's a good comment.
my consensus from leaving that night was that nobody wanted those large projects.
Yeah, and I'm not so certain you're going to see many more of those. The one in Empire Boulevard was kind of a unique situation because, number one, what was happening was the properties down there were contaminated,
Right.
and a lot of the contaminants were starting to eke into the water system down there towards Runaway Bay. Luckily, based on the testing that we had, it didn't happen, but it was starting to move that way. So it cost them several $1 million to clean that out. And it costs another $1.5 million or $2 million to do the road improvements to get the middle turn lane. So when you start throwing those numbers onto a development, somebody has to be able to pay for it, and the only way you can do it is to get density. So that's why, and actually, it does look dense from the road, but when you actually go inside the project and you're walking around the project, it's actually not that bad when you're walking through it. And there is a lot of green space, and there actually are some really nice walking paths that head into Abraham Lincoln Park that they had to build.
Well, especially now that we have the sidewalk that came with that project up Empire Boulevard that gave us that connection.
And they had to do that, but in one of the requirements that the town has on any development on the waterfront, they have to provide waterfront access to the public. It's one of the conditions of approval that you have to
I think
adhere to.
if you drive past, and I think this is because, again, when I got here, like 15, 16 years ago, there was nothing there.
Right.
And I think it's the shock value of coming around that corner and the view is blocked a certain portion because of the buildings.
It
And
is.
I think
It is.
that is probably, if you start digging around to the root of the frustration,
Yeah.
most of those folks probably haven't gone in and gone past the buildings to the waterfront to see.
And they have the right to do that now.
Yeah.
They didn't have that right prior to, and actually, it's a good point,
But
because
is
that,
that, but maybe, where I was going with that is, that sounds to me like a communication opportunity to get out
Right.
there, say, hey, listen, there is this available to you.
absolutely.
And not diminishing that the big projects are not well thought of, but I don't know if they realize what we got in return as a community, which is the pass, the waterfront, those things. And I don't know if that was well communicated. All they saw was big buildings go up.
True.
The impression I got was the people that, and this was before I was involved in anything, was the people that were for the LaSalle's Landing area didn't want, were surprised to see that the answer to that project was building those,
Yeah.
cramming all those apartments in
Yeah.
there. I guess one of the questions that came out of that for me was, a couple people mentioned possibility of a new type of, no classification, a new type of zoning that may be open space zoning or recreational use zoning. With the option of maybe protecting some of the areas that we have now that are open.
Right.
If that's the
And
intention.
I think Bob Peterson actually submitted a
Yeah.
list.
Yeah, that was.
And I looked at the list, and actually on the list, there are many, many properties that are owned by either the town of Penfield, the county of Monroe. Some of them were donated to us as open space areas.
Or the nature conservancy.
But
Nature
I guess the
Conservancy.
question that was generated from me from that was, everybody says we don't have to worry about changing the zoning on Shadow Pines because the town owns it now. Is it inconceivable that the town could sell that?
Well, first of all, the
that
public
single-family
bought
zoning
it.
would
The
still go
public
with it.
bought it. So if the town were, for some bizarre reason,
Well, I mean,
Do
it
it.
would be a set of unusual circumstances, but the town could, in theory, have a meeting and sell it, right? And then it would still be zoned.
no, it doesn't work that easily. What happens is, because it was bonded and because the public voted and they had to vote for the bond, the public would have to vote again to sell the property. You couldn't just outright go in and say, well, I think we'll sell off 50 acres here or something. You can't do that. And that's why when the town owns property, the zoning is really immaterial at that point in time, because it's public property. It's owned by the public. The public has to make a determination through a vote, through a referendum, that they want to sell that property for some reason. Now, is that to say that you couldn't sell town property somewhere? Every so often you get a strip of land that's between two properties that is, it's not good for anything. It was left there for a potential right-of-way to another piece of property that doesn't function anymore.
No,
for
I
that
understand
purpose.
that, but my
You could
question-
sell
My
that off
question
by
gets to-
referendum.
Now, though.
A lot of times you see government doing things that you didn't think they were
No.
going to
Yeah,
do,
but
so.
now
That's
I'm
really
saying
taboo.
To protect
believe me.
that,
It's in the town parkland bank too now, right?
No, it's not actually, because we have not, at this point in time, we've not
Does that
taken
makes
any
a difference?
they
funds.
didn't buy this Parkland.
It's not it's not alienated yet, because we've not taken any money from any governmental agency to improve it or anything at that point in time.
But is it planned to be?
I don't know, because it's so new. Just so you know, I think you all know that we have gone out to get RFPs for a master plan, conceptual master plan layout to what's gonna happen. That's the first step.
Because then if it becomes designated parkland, if you were to go sell it, you'd have to
You could have
show
stayed in
how
New
that
York.
you would have
That's right.
to
It's-
replace it acre by acre in kind.
That's right. It's really an
But
act
that
of
is-
the state legislature to get it
But
out.
if it were to go that way.
And I guess my last question was, somebody asked me, and I didn't know the answer. We've been hearing that what's holding back the residential development on the east side is the lack of sewers.
Well, it's a lack of sewers and zoning. The zoning on the east side is 2-acre zoning. It's been that way since 1981.
Right, but that's tied in somewhat to the fact that.
It
you have
is,
to
you're
have septic
absolutely
system.
right. I don't think there's any intent on anybody's part. Certainly it wasn't in the last comprehensive plan update, and I'm assuming it won't be in this one, because in actuality, we have less access to sanitary sewers now than we did in
Right. Let me get
2010.
my question out and then I'll be quiet.
Sure, no, keep going, you're doing great.
If at some point, this is a 10-year plan, if at some point, Webster is able to bond whatever they need to do to increase their
Right.
sewer capacity, and all of a sudden, we're faced with increased sewer capacity, do we need to look at, as part of this 10-year plan, if we want to keep some of that open space out there, open space, do we need to look at zoning that now? Because the development pressure is not gonna stop, and eventually
No, it's
someone's gonna
not.
come up with the money to
And I
increase the
think,
sewer capacities in Webster, and then we'll be back where we are now, so.
I think that certainly you're gonna look at open space as an issue. The zoning itself right now is 2 acres. 2 acres is the least desirable type of zoning that any
But
development.
we all know how
wants.
easy it is to change zoning. You
Yeah,
did it
it's
for
not
the-
that easy,
you did it-
especially,
you did it for the
especially in East
mixed-use
Penfield.
district.
Do you know how
So-
long that took? Almost 10 years. Nothing easy about that.
Well,
Well, and
it's not out of the
remember
question. If
though,
we're looking
that,
at something now 10 years from here,
Yeah.
you know, it's
so
just.
remember, that was a recommendation of the previous comprehensive plan update committee. And that was a recommendation that everybody said, well, if that's what they want, it makes sense, we'll move forward on it. If your recommendation is we want to keep East Penfield green and we want to keep it open, you know, obviously you can't prevent people from building a house on 2 acres of land, but you're certainly not going to get a housing development or a tract housing development on 2 acres of land. Especially even 10 years from now, I doubt we're going to have those issues worked out with Webster to develop a lot of land. I mean, if we do it, it's going to be towards the Jackson Road area, Jackson Road, maybe to 250, that area, but certainly not beyond
Not at the
250.
border up there.
Because they don't even have a good sewer system up there at this point in time.
Right,
They're
but
certainly
we're
gonna take
not
care of
gonna
their
have
own
it in
needs
10
in
years, and if we
50.
don't address it at all, we're just pushing it off
Well,
to.
and that's why you're here.
The
I
next
mean,
10
that's the whole
years, so.
purpose of having a committee, is to make rational recommendations based on what you think the community's supportive of. And if you think that if it's supportive of keeping it at 2 acres or keeping it open, that's your recommendation.
Or, you know, how we've kind of tried to, we've shown you the other tool we have in our toolbox when it comes to development of large properties is using cluster zoning, where you don't change the zoning that's out there. For example, the state's 2 acre zoning. You look at that entire parent parcel, under conventional zoning, how many houses could you put there with 2 acres? So, you know, 50 acre property, 20 houses typically, because you gotta do the math, take out utilities, roads, so on and so forth. Okay, now let's look at how can we best preserve the land and cluster the homes back down to like a half-acre lot, smaller than a half-acre lot, because not a lot of people want that much land, and preserve
The open
30 acres
space
of
around
land.
it, yeah.
more than that.
And that's
And
the beauty of.
And that
Belmont
land never
278.
gets subdivided again because you've already used the density towards that development. So now that thing's locked and preserved for its a lifetime. So when open space is kind of always considered in a lot of our projects, even though it's not required. For basic residential projects, if it's not under cluster, we're not really talking about it. But under cluster,
Well, I
it
think we're
becomes a
addressing,
talking
that's what we're
point.
talking about in the 10-year comprehensive plan. I
Yeah.
mean, you guys might not be thinking about it in development, but it may or may not be an important point for our committee. And then we would hope that the town would follow what our recommendations are.
Right.
Well, it's certainly a talking point about how do you envision the next 10 years of lands east of 250? You know, the ones that haven't been developed yet for, you know, large housing and then.
Well, I think it gets to the zoning, the whole zoning idea of, and I don't know that much about zoning, but is it possible to make districts that are recreational use?
Well, we had a nice
Because, you know,
discussion the other night about
addressed-
that.
Jim
Yeah.
can talk to the extreme difficulties of that.
Well, no, the
Well, we haven't
answer
addressed
is,
Shadow Lake or Penfield Country Club.
the answer is you can
Which are
do it.
two other places that are zoned residential, that could flip fairly easily.
You've got to be careful about the term residential, and I think Tim Murphy made a good point the other night. I think it's incumbent upon us to actually do some definitions of recreation, open space, active recreation, passive recreation, sanctuary. You can do just about anything. The only issue is, number one, you have to have a vision of what recreation really is.
Right.
Yep.
Because recreation could be Silver Stadium, or, you know, could be anything.
I
You
think
got to
that was
really
one
know
of the
what you
points that someone
want.
at the meeting had, was
The other
they
part of it
defined
is, if you do change somebody's zoning and you take away the value of what it is now to a lesser value, you have to compensate them for it. You can't just take away that value because you know what's going to end up happening. They're going to go to court, and they may or not win depending on the situation, but they are going to spend a lot of money, and so are we. And we know about that case that Dolomite had downstate a few years ago, where they had that done to them. They ended up winning their lawsuit. They received damages, and all their legal fees were paid for. So you got to be careful about, you know, how you deal with people's properties. If they're zoned currently for one use, at value, say it's half acre, for instance, and you want to make that go to 1 acre, you gotta be careful because you may have to compensate for that extra half acre for each unit that you have up there.
So Jim, for the folks that are, for the properties that are, again, county-owned, or the owners of that property are willing to make that zoning change, I think that, to me, that would make sense. I think you're gonna find with Shadow Pines, or some of those Shadow Lakes,
Shadow Lake.
they're gonna tell you, no. I mean, I couldn't
Well,
imagine they would.
they may or may not. They might say, we would support a rezoning, but we want to do a rezoning maybe that caters to senior housing, where you don't have a big impact to the school district, and you don't have a big impact to traffic generation during peak periods. I mean, you have to kind of think about that. It could be something totally different than what you might think about right now, where we're
Yeah,
just going to keep it open
but
space.
I'm just saying that rather than battle the folks that, for the properties that are owned by somebody, right now we got a $10 million sale on a piece of property that I don't think I didn't see that coming. So, and again,
Yeah.
we don't know what's gonna happen with that if it's sold, and how that's, the way it's owned, and all the rest of that. So I think what we need to do is put something in place for that not to happen in the future, but you've gotta take the property owner's desires into account.
You have to, and certainly, I think it's going to work out for the best with the property you're talking about. But, if we were to change that zoning without the property owner's permission, even though they may not want to use it for that purpose, we would have to compensate them for that. As a matter of fact, I'm sure appraisals are being done for that property as we speak, based on what the current zoning is. It may not ever be that, but that's what the value of it is. So, you gotta be careful. You can do it, you can do all sorts of things. I guess my comment would be, if you really wanted to do something with the golf courses, I would sit down with the golf course owners and say, what is your vision over the next 20 years or 10 years, and find out what their thoughts are. They might say to you, we're not going to do anything other than keep it the way it is, but if we were to do something, this is what we might like to do with portions of it. So we can certainly do that with you. I mean, we can work that out, or we could have them come in and talk to you about that. We'd be happy to do that.
Because I'd like to do that for both the golf course and the quarry, if we could, just to kind of understand where.
Yeah, I think you're going to hear from Dolomite say, we're not closing that quarry down for the next 50 years. I mean, unless driverless cars are popping up and you don't need roadways the way you need them now, or parking lots, or whatever the case may be, but their intent is to continue to utilize that. I personally talked to Dolomite about that, and their intent is to continue to utilize it. A lot of us won't be around by the time that ends. Yeah.
So just getting back to your original question, Jim, about the sort of the stuff that popped out. I probably no surprise, I took very detailed notes, and I actually made copies if anybody wasn't there and didn't look at the video, would like copies of, if you can read my scratchy handwriting. And it also includes the handout that Bob Peterson gave of Penfield Recreation and Sanctuary Sites. So that's the last page. So I'll just leave those here for anybody who wants to take a copy.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And we will be getting you all the comments that were generated by that meeting and the following.
Oh, yeah, I figured, I
as
thought,
possible.
well, I was going to type out.
Chuck, you made a good point,
I had
though.
the
Oh,
same,
but
I
no,
had the
but-
same thing running, don't worry.
Oh, okay, good. So, but what popped out to me was, again, as Chuck was talking about, issues related to zoning. I mean, other than the two guys who came in to argue
Right.
personal cases about
Right.
zoning, but zoning specifically with respect to some aspect of kind of open space or recreation, something like that, however we want to define it, but bigger spaces, not residential or commercial spaces. Climate and sustainability came up. A few people brought that up in different ways.
And Mark's been talking about it since we started this committee as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And transportation came up in a couple of different contexts, whether it was people who wanted bike paths, sidewalks, people considering transportation associated with mixed development, that sort of stuff.
Right.
So transportation came up in a few different ways. Development in general, I think LaSalle's Landing generated a lot of interest, more so than any one other thing, and this was from obviously a very small audience of people talking
Right.
about it. And historic preservation came up, and kind of, to me, it was sort of like two contexts. One, historic preservation as in just because it's good to engage in that, and the other because it relates to the character of the town, which the first speaker talked about the character of the town. She didn't specifically mention historic development, but it tied into that notion of what is Penfield, what is the character of this town, how do we preserve or foster the notion that we are, you know, we are something unique and not just some generic suburban community. So those I thought were like the five sort of high points
I think you're right on.
to me.
I think that was a really key one right there, the historic aspect of it, the identity of Penfield. I think, Donna, you kind of hit on that. I took notes. I only had 3 bullet points, though. School, increase in school enrollment and the growth of the schools, obviously. We talked about that a little bit, though. Vacant commercial buildings throughout the town of Penfield and what to do with them, what the plans are for them.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't even know if that's a planning.
It is, and we work constantly with the property owners to do, the big problem we're having right now, we usually have about a 93 or 92, 93% occupancy rate for the commercial development in Penfield. It's starting to wane a little bit right now. We've had a low spot, probably our lowest spot since all the years I've been here. And I gotta tell you, it's been difficult because you've got businesses now that you can buy stuff online. You don't need to go to them anymore. You've got to have a really unique business or something that everybody really feels is iconic.
It's that
to go
shift
to.
from retail to service, because a lot of retail is
Yeah.
at your fingertips on your phone or on your computer.
It's difficult.
And there's still a demand for these, I'm gonna quote unquote strip malls, where there's just smaller spaces that are available for smaller uses. Those are coming back more. But, you know, your big box retail and, you know, vacant office buildings, that stuff, I mean, good luck trying to chase that and trying to manage it from our end of things. We try to help people when they need the information and get, like, in touch with those building owners or
Yeah,
tell
we deal with them a
you can
lot.
use
The
this
interesting
space.
thing is that we had a real problem with office space over the last several years. Now recently, we're filling our office space, which is kind of
Yeah.
ironic since you can do a lot of work at home in your living room versus having to go to an office, but we are filling office space. Some of the things that are happening are kind of weird, you know, the things like Qdoba leaving and just shutting down their operations all over the place for
That's
no reason
a
at all.
national company doing its thing.
You know, then you had Arby's leaving on Creek Street, and it's like things that you would never anticipate happening are happening, and hopefully we're gonna get some people in here to start doing some things to get
Goodwill's going into
Goodwill's
the
going in.
Arby's.
There are, yeah, they're filling some spaces, but we are having a little bit of a lull right now because of what's happened with the national scene on
Well,
retail.
I think one of the things, though, that, you know, sometimes it's not, you know, the broken leg you can't see under the table. It's like the sort of like the pimple on somebody's cheek that you see. And I think in the Four Corners areas where there are a few chronically empty,
Yes.
rundown buildings, and that's, people drive through there and it's like, well, that's Penfield. Oh, yeah, you know, that's
Yeah,
the
you're
impression
right.
they get.
And the problem with Penfield is versus a place like the village of Webster or the village of Fairport or Pittsburgh. Penfield, you know, once they put that 4-lane highway in, they took away a lot of the character of the Four Corners. And it's very, very difficult to deal with it now because
It's a pass-through
they
now.
it's a pass-through. They took away the parking that was on street all those years along Penfield Road. It's made it very difficult for people to want to be there or want to stay there because it's difficult. Once they start growing their business, they need more room and they can't stay in that spot. I've seen a lot of that over the years. I give a lot of credit to the people that have stayed there over the years that have been there, you know, 10, 20, 30 years or more.
And to the new ones who are trying to go on.
They truly have done a great job of anchoring that Four Corners area, and but it's fun because you get a lot of young people now coming in that want to do things, and we're getting a lot of young people coming in. This month coming up, we're going to have a young lady who's taking over that building behind Salon Enza. It was an old, it was basically an old garage, but it's been refurbished a couple of times. She's going to start another hair salon and spa area there. So there are young people coming in to do that kind of thing. But you're right, it's been difficult and not an easy situation when you don't have on-street parking and easy access to parking. Yeah.
I had one more.
What I heard,
Oh,
sorry, go, sorry.
No, oh, God.
What I heard on a few different occasions from 3 different speakers were concerns over multifamily development continuing at the rates that they are. And I think that's being faced all over the area by all different communities as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing.
Got a
And
lot of
that
people
kind of
that-
ties in to the comments earlier about the bayfront view and things
Yeah.
like that. So I think.
It's amazing to me how many people want to live in apartments now versus single-family homes. A lot of them have lived here a long time and don't want to deal with it anymore, so they want to move into an apartment and then move off to Florida in the wintertime. Got a lot of younger people that want to live in an apartment because they either don't want to take care of a house or don't know how to, or can't afford it, can't afford to. It's an interesting phenomenon. Now, the other side of that is obviously the group that's been doing a lot of this apartment building over the last several years is facing some issues now that they have to deal with, and I don't think you're going to see as much apartment development
I think
going on as you did.
one thing, I don't think it would be as much of a concern if it were for senior apartments.
Yeah,
More specifically, for future planning, so to speak,
Right.
as opposed to open,
general public.
general,
Yeah, general use.
general public.
In our last comp plan called for
Apartments.
that. I mean, that was identified as being, Penfield has been one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing town in the county. We recognized that 10 years ago. One of the main recommendations was that more senior housing had to be built to accommodate the aging population to stay in place, That was a big
In
thing.
the master plan, the grand scheme of things, maybe that can be addressed in the form of, zoning specific as far as limiting
Mm-hmm.
multifamily, so to speak, to senior housing as
Yeah.
opposed to open season on all kinds of apartments. Something to
It's
consider.
something to look at, and we might
There
do
was-
some research for you
there
to
was like
see
three
if
different
we can do that
speakers that
legally, but I
Brought
probably
some,
can.
concerns up to
Yeah.
that effect.
Yeah, I see over the next 10 years, you got a lot of people in their 50s and 60s that are gonna be in their 70s and 80s, and we have to deal with it. We have to accommodate them.
And one of those offerings from the comp plan again was the mixed use district, which our first project in came with the continuum of care senior housing,
Right.
and they're underway.
Yeah, that was a nice project as it related to seniors. It provided for memory care, provided for assisted living, and then independent. But the independent, as you noted, is for general use, not just seniors.
Does the data suggest people want to stay? I mean, New York's one of the
Yeah,
most expensive
very much
states in
so. As a matter of
America.
fact, we've got
Especially-
several
We don't want to
people-
build and then have it sit empty.
Well,
'cause everyone's
especially
somewhere
locally,
else.
yeah. Well, and these guys are not gonna build without a market study to support it. We're not the
Correct.
ones who say, go build this here. They
Right.
come to us saying, we've done the market research, we know that we need this
And this is
property
gonna
for
be-
this many units to make this project work. And there's a lot of data behind it before they show up at our doorstep. They have so many internal conversations before they even have a meeting here. But just from the general public in our conversations, we get calls from everybody saying, where can I move in Penfield to
Yeah.
downsize?
We've had a
It's-
lot of
it's at
people that
least
lived here a
once
long
week.
time, and they can't find what they need to be here. And as a result, they have to move to another community, which is kind of heartbreaking because they've been here for 40, 50 years.
Just today, we had a conversation with a former employee who's moving up to Webster because there's nowhere for him to downsize here. Or if there is, they're fully booked up, and it's one of the very few examples we have of an area that is something that isn't owner occupied. It's rental, and still a very normal, comfortable way of living in like a townhouse setting. But you get to turn the key and walk away whenever you want to go on your trip and not have to worry about a thing you leave behind. We just don't have a lot of that.
Townhouses are a nice alternative to apartments, and every time a townhouse
Yeah.
project, we haven't had very many lately, but a couple of years ago, we had a couple, and they sold in minutes. I mean, it was just
And
really
they still
quick.
do now when they come back on the market.
And
They're not there
we do
long.
keep people that have lived here in big homes, they sold their big homes, they moved into a smaller townhouse, and they're very, very happy. I mean,
So if we identify something like townhomes as being more desirable than an apartment complex, is there anything we could do to encourage
We have that zoning district. We
Yeah,
have
that
TH,
that
we have a
exists.
townhome zoning district that you guys can
They can
use
get that specific of townhouses, yes, apartments,
in the
no.
code.
By
Okay.
definition.
It's in our residential code, and you're allowed, one of your recommendations can suggest that as a form of a built setting. Say, we see this piece of property here, we know people are, they want to get more density on it, but we don't want to see apartments. We recommend this property to be rezoned to townhomes, given the area around it and the demand for that style of homes.
What is the name of the zoning category that apartment buildings fall into?
Multiple residents.
Multiple residents?
Yes.
Okay.
MR.
And going back to your comment a few minutes ago, and I'm sorry it's taking me so long to get back there, but I think we probably need to go back, just as a little finalized look at these different zoning districts. If you want to look at East Penfield, and you want to look at certain areas that, might be more suited to a different zone. maybe we should go through and just talk about those to get a good feel for you before you start putting together your thoughts, your final thoughts for the recommendations.
Yes.
That's what we're here for. Daniel, you had one more. Sorry, we gotta come back to that.
Oh, you're fine. Actually, it ties into what Chuck and Donna were talking about, just recreational sites being protected for further zoning. But the one thing that somebody said during the meeting that kind of struck was outdoor recreational area for kids. He said something like creating skate parks, outdoor pool areas, spray parks, something like that. Some kind of destination activity for families in Penfield, because we lack any of that.
Picked up 212 acres of land that is out there for a lot of space.
And
Not saying to
Rothfuss
use it
Park.
all there, but there's a lot of parks in
There's a
Penfield.
lot of space in Rothfuss Park that would be great. It's already got
The whole
bathrooms.
back part of
And you got
Shadow
bathrooms out there.
Pines, we walked past, I walked with the Shadow Pines
Mhm.
team, and it's, you would have to do very little to build something like you're talking about. I mean, even a hill for sledding on it, they have great hills back there, so.
Well, that could be addressed as part of this comprehensive plan, or, I'm sorry, part of the conceptual master plan for that property. We'll certainly be going through, and we'll be looking at that as well, I'm sure, as we move into the final phases of starting the process of writing the comp plan, so.
Yeah, once the RFP is awarded, then we'll dive a little more into it and
Mhm.
see how that mixes with this.
Is there someone that can maybe walk us through a little, because I'm not really clear on the legality of, so when we start talking about recreation, the definitions is part of it, but what's legal? Because I don't want us as a group to make recommendations that have no possibility of being carried forward because they're just not a legal approach to something.
Well, I think the legality of it is, you have the right to make a recommendation as to what you think.
Well, yeah, but I'd like to focus
But more
recommendations on
importantly,
things
is
that are
if
realistic.
you're making a
Yes,
recommendation
yeah.
and somebody
our
that owns
goal.
the property has no interest in doing that and is more than willing to challenge you on it, it kind of is, kind of a waste of everybody's time and effort to do it. But if you can work out details with somebody who may have land like that, and they want to do something of a recreation nature, and they think that they can make a profit doing that, certainly, you can come up with some arrangement to, make both parties happy, the town and that.
As he said earlier, it starts with talking to that property owner, bringing him in and say, hey, we recognize your property, we have a recommendation.
How many of the ones that Bob gave us are privately owned?
Not that many, actually.
Yeah,
I was
most
pretty
of them
impressed
are
that we had as many as we
Because
did.
I'm gonna go back to what Chuck said, if they're owned by the town, just rezone them. I mean, even though you're saying to us, no, they could never ever happen, we can recommend that you rezone all of those, done, so that it doesn't, and that doesn't, it's not an issue. But the privately held ones, we're gonna have to do exactly what you said, we're gonna have to talk to each of those property owners to see what they're thinking. And you said in the case of in some of them, like the quarry, there's no need to even have that conversation because we're pretty clear on where they stand, so.
Well, about 16 out of 18 are either owned by the town of Penfield, the Penfield School District, the County of Monroe, or some other entity such as the Nature Conservancy or the Genesee Land Trust.
That they don't let go of land forever.
They never let go of their land, so.
Probably say that the swamp's not
Those
gonna be
two,
allowed to
if
develop
any,
the pressure.
are ones that would be almost impossible to develop
So,
by nature of what the properties
and
are.
I'll give you an example of what we
Yeah,
did.
because this
The
one I'm not
properties
supposed to see.
along the
This
shoreline
one,
of
I don't think
Arundequoit
we
Bay
can do with that.
several years ago were zoned R120. And you can imagine the constraints associated with those properties being on sloped areas going down to the bay and being heavily wooded and all sorts of water issues and wetland issues. So we actually did rezone the county property, which is now Abraham Lincoln Park, with their permission. And we rezoned the properties adjacent to it up to the Webster Town line to CR2, which was Conservation Residential 2 acre. We didn't have that many property owners to deal with in terms of them supporting it or not supporting it, because they all recognized they couldn't get high-density development on their properties anyways, so they bought into it. So we did rezone it so that you couldn't have a tract housing project on any of those properties. But again, 95% of them were owned by the County of Monroe as part of Abraham Lincoln Park. So it did work out in that case, but everybody was in agreement that the zoning would not affect their ability to develop the properties.
Oh.
I think they were looking for large estate-type lots anyways, But as it's turned out, they're not even getting that because it's just not cost effective to run utilities to these locations.
And the
get
topography
for one
over
or two
there.
houses, it's just not worth
And
it.
the topography over there is not what you want to be building on.
No, absolutely not. That's why we did it. It was all blow sand, and if you looked at the grades out there, they were just astronomical in terms of trying to get roads in and that type of thing. We could never take dedication of those roads because the grade changes were
steep.
so steep that we couldn't get our trucks up and down them, so.
What is a 1,000-acre swamp, Genesee Land Trust, or what?
It's a nature conservancy.
Nature Conservancy?
Yes,
Okay.
and that is zone R1, but again, you can't develop it because of what it is.
No one's gonna develop this one.
You can't, that's right.
There was one of the speakers was talking about something that you guys had approved on in Glendivere's. I wasn't familiar with,
There was a project from the owner of Glendivere's a couple of years ago. 2 years ago?
I'm saying 3, I think.
3 years ago. He wanted to expand his parking area, and the only way he could do that, there's a hill that kind of goes up, and he wanted to cut the grade on that hill and bring it back, and then take that material out, have somebody take it away, whatever, and expand the parking a little bit.
Because the existing conditions were not great. He was parking double-sided on that road.
That was the problem, we couldn't get emergency access vehicles to the place, especially during an event. So we did grant it. It's becoming an issue for him though, because nobody wants the material and they don't want to truck it off even for free. So that kind of sits there doing nothing.
Turning into more of a financial headache for him at this point. They did go through the exercise of obtaining site plan approval with an engineered site plan to show a hill that could be graded properly and excavating. I don't have a pointer, but where Doug has the arrow there, he's outlining that little part of the hill. They came back with a properly engineered plan to show that they could do parking that accounted for runoff, for stabilizing the slopes, for not impacting the wetlands, and providing sufficient parking for the business there based on their occupancy load to avoid having parking on Old Browncroft Boulevard like they do now.
In addition, they were gonna provide some parking for the
Trailhead.
trailhead.
Yeah, 2 spaces.
And clearing out for the trailhead to Monroe County.
But nothing.
That didn't really- that wasn't
That was
really-
ancillary, but.
Yes, it wasn't really a part of someone's concern, as you brought up,
Yeah.
Chuck, about cutting into a hillside. That's why we have.
that's, I didn't know what it was, so.
Yeah, good question. That's why we have civil engineers and
But that was
They
a
come up
steep
with this.
slope E-pod though, right?
It was,
Yeah.
yes.
sandy hill that.
And again,
That's
remember, the
going
E-pods are not prohibitive. The
Yeah.
E-pods are regulatory. You've got to do a lot of things to get an E-pod permit, especially in a case like this. They spent probably way more money than they ever thought they were going to have to for a site plan review on this thing, but again, economics drives everything, and right now, the economics for him to do this are not there.
And for us,
He's asked the county to buy his property, he's asked us to buy the property. Of course, he wants tons of money for it, and, have that in his county, so it sits there.
plus in just the name of safety, it was a worthwhile project to go through if it allowed for a safer parking situation down there.
There's another interesting situation that's occurred in that neighborhood recently, and it's not recently, it's been a while, but the old Small World Daycare Center, the nursery school that was.
Yes.
That has become an issue because, number one, it's not in the pre-foreclosure yet. It's still being taken care of and the taxes are being paid, but it's an 8,000 square foot building with a parking lot in a residential zoning district that nobody wants for a single family residence. And I've had 2 or 3 people call about it, asking what can I do, and I said, you gotta use permitted uses for the site or conditionally permitted uses. And they say, well, nothing fits in there other than maybe some apartments. And I said, well, if that's the case, then you have to make your case to the zoning board of appeals for a use variance to allow it to be something other than a permitted or conditionally permitted use. And I'm not so certain that any new person coming in could actually get a use variance because there's no hardship on their part. They don't own it, so they haven't lost anything. So the owners themselves would probably have to come in and apply for that. And I'm not quite sure how long it's been up for sale. I think it's been for a while now. 2 years?
2 weeks.
2 weeks?
The sign's only been up for, it may have been
See-
sale, but the sign itself is.
See, that's not long
And there's
enough.
not even a listing for it, so
Yeah.
it must be some, I think
A
they've got
by
it.
owner thing or something?
No, they've got it listed, I think it's commercial, it's not, so if you go looking for the listing, you can't find it.
Yeah.
2 weeks would never be long enough for a zoning board to make a determination that you could not utilize it for what it's currently zoned for. So, I mean, they're gonna have to wait a while, and they're gonna have to demonstrate that they've dropped the price several times, because it's just not cost effective to sell it for what it, you know, what they want it to be.
Yeah, and like I said, I can, in this case, I can speak for that neighborhood. They would, I have no doubt there would be a lawsuit of monumental proportions, starting with Bob, if they tried to do anything with that property other than,
Read.
yeah.
Well,
Oh, yeah.
and I'm not so certain it's in the best interest for the neighborhood to have a daycare center back there again. I mean, that's a lot of traffic.
Well, you know, but
coming
we
down.
actually, to be honest, we got used to that, and you're talking, it was a very narrow window of like 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes in the afternoon where you had traffic, and we were used to that. I don't think anybody would fight that being used again for something similar, or even an elder care facility, but I can't see them, if any other business tried to go in there, it would be,
In elder care, you're not gonna put, you don't want steps, so.
Yeah, they won't, that wouldn't be real.
I'm just saying, that, I mean, something within the same confines of what they.
I think if you could get some kind of, if you could get some kind of residential use for it, I don't know what that would be, if it's multi-residential, maybe 4 units or something like that.
It's a big property.
Certainly, you're not
How about
gonna
a
get,
group
you're not gonna get a
home?
30-unit building in there or anything like
How
that.
big is the building, Joe? How
It's
many
8,000
square
square
homes?
feet.
And how many
Not bad.
spaces are there?
You're allowed
Parking
up to-
spaces are there?
Can you pull it out?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's 24 hours.
Yep, it's right there.
100 homes.
That's what this actually
The only-
was,
the only
a
other
larger
thing
home
you
that's
could
been
probably-
converted a couple times.
Yeah.
Bring in there.
Sure.
Would be like a small
It would
church.
be permitted, yeah, as a
Well,
permitted single family
it
use.
would
You know,
be-
the question really is, would the neighborhood want to consider having, you know, a place of assembly versus just,
Well, aren't
residential
they
units.
Well, I thought
allowed in
like-
residential districts?
Yeah, with churches, you don't have a say, I mean, they can put them anywhere, right?
7,000 square feet.
yeah,
Give or
there's,
take.
I thought there was a little more to it than that. Yeah,
They may be including
there's some
the
more down here
1,400.
that they've got, but
Does the zoning lend itself to that occupancy?
for a church,
Yeah. In a
churches are
residential?
traditionally permitted uses within residential zoning districts.
Yeah, that sounds,
I mean, it's certainly big enough for a small church, that's for sure.
I mean, that's just.
But again,
another-
churches are not what they were when we were all growing up. Churches are
Yeah.
busy places now. You look at Browncroft Community,
Yeah.
that's busy almost every night of the week.
Well, I mean, at this point, the rate the properties start to dilapidate, if they wait another 4 or 5 years, it'll probably fall down and be a non-issue. I mean, it's-
That's pretty much what 2 realtors told me was, as they were looking at it. But again, it's a situation, number one, you don't want it to go to a point where it does fall down, because that's not good for the neighborhood. Secondly, you don't want to put something in there, you know, even a church. Churches have a tendency to start out small, then all of a sudden their congregation starts growing, and then,
Yeah.
you know, the parking isn't adequate for it. Now they're
Well, they
taking-
tend,
I mean, how
they tend
many
to
acres-
use,
how
they
many
tend to
acres is
use the
that?
land as well for other activities, and then neighbors start to complain.
How many
that
acres
They're
is
too
that?
noisy, they're doing a cook-off today, or they have the kids
Probably
outside,
change.
and we don't like,
But you
Probably
can't
close to
discriminate against that
And
either.
that's
Yeah.
half-acre lot in there,
You've got to
right?
allow
Well,
it.
it's half acre
Okay.
zoning, yeah. It's
Yeah,
R1.
that's right, there's
You
RLUIPA
cannot-
laws now that you
yeah.
cannot
So that
prevent
property's
them
probably
from
You
going
cannot-
in.
If it's 2 acres,
It
they
might be
could put
close.
them.
I'm not a
Could be
fan
either.
of putting
Well, not
churches
just-
into commercial
just
districts,
let
but
conversations.
you can't stop it from happening
Right.
either.
Doug, how big is the property? George had that question earlier.
Because if it's,
Oh,
1.3 acres.
well, so not really, no, I mean, you could, I mean, if you knocked down the existing structure, you could put 2 houses on there under the current zoning.
See, and
Closer to one.
that's exactly the situation. I mean, you have to tear it down, which is gonna cost some money, but you could possibly make that money back and break even, and that's all you have to do, is be able to break even. You don't have to make a profit, you have to break even under the current zoning. So those are the kinds of things the zoning board would be looking for them to address. And 2 weeks of being up for sale is not even close to that. I mean,
It may have been longer, I mean, I just noticed the sign a couple weeks ago, but it's, you know.
But it's a good example of what, on a small property, in the middle of a community, what could be a future best use for it. So. Smack in the middle, in one of the most inaccessible neighborhoods.
Hey, I resemble that one.
That's, you know, it's barely
well, it's
accessible.
accessible, it's just that it just doesn't lend itself to the character of the neighborhood anymore, based on what's out there.
No, I mean, it was always kind of never, I mean, like you said, it was just something that was tolerated by the folks that lived there.
It must have been I think it started in 1960 or somewhere around there.
I had a taxi driver that was one of the original owners of that, And he said they sold out because the town wouldn't let them expand. They reached a point where they needed to expand in order to increase profitability, and the town was like, yeah, no, you're not building any more structures on that property, so they sold it.
It's gigantic.
Yep. Because I guess they wanted to go from whatever 60 kids or they had in there, or 50 kids
Yeah.
to, yeah.
So you got little things like this all over the town, here and there. It's just a function of changing times and, you know, these kinds of uses not surviving for one reason or another. I'm kind of surprised, you know, it's ironic, daycares now are booming again all of a sudden. Everybody wants a daycare, but
I don't know how that one
that town
failed.
would
yeah.
not comply with any requirement for a daycare at this point in time, I wouldn't think under regulations.
Well, I think these ones, they struggle with, you know, now your commercial daycares that are popping up, to Jim's point of like, you know, now we got, you know, fully operated, fully staffed, commercial business that is a daycare that's operating nearby to a neighborhood, and, you know, you're gonna pay a lot more for that, but I think a lot of these smaller ones have a lot of competition with those as they come up and get built in the town.
Yeah,
Well, any new
makes sense.
daycare now is gonna be on one floor, it's not gonna be on multiple floors.
No.
And you gotta watch these kids like a hawk, and it's not an easy thing to do in a building like that.
How much acreage is that?
1.3.
1.3?
Yep. So, and I think we need to do that. We'll need to go around town and start looking at nuances and look at, you know, the size of these properties and what you're thinking about for East Penfield, what you're thinking about for, you know, certain areas of town that we talked about. The two gentlemen that came in, we'll have to look at that and determine what's an appropriate use for those properties, if anything.
Are there other things that anyone heard during the, Michael?
So two points, two thoughts. The first is that 9 years from now, when we start doing this all over again, I think it would be helpful to have that meeting much earlier on in the process.
Okay.
So that it could kind of guide us, or just have it in the back of our mind, what do the people who reside here want? You know, so I think that would have been helpful. Now, fortunately, I think a lot of the points that were made are things we've already been talking about, so, but just might be helpful to have that earlier on.
And also, I think so it won't really be 9 years because it's going to be after the census next time. right?
Yes.
Our goal
I
would be
think we
to
want to do that,
yeah.
absolutely.
But I agree with you with the needing more time, but I think it'll be really valuable that we're doing this after the next census. So we'll be going on fresh census data for these decisions about parks and housing and
Yeah.
blah, 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 blah.
And technology will change a lot in the next 10 years. Things that we can't even imagine that are going to take place. Who knows if you'll need as much parking area as you do now, because you
We're already seeing that.
you may have vehicles that are driving you to and from places without any need to park anywhere. They just go on to somebody else while you're doing what you do, and then you come back half an hour later and they're waiting for you.
We're not seeing that yet.
It may happen, you know, they're talking about it all over the country now.
Well, we're already seeing just the reduced need in parking though, just for average driving. You know, how many, we look at the business park that's coming in down in Panorama, and they're coming in asking for parking variances because our code says one thing, and they're like, yeah, we need about 100 less parking spaces than what your code requires. Okay.
You know, and even the bus system, I mean, now, back in the day, you got on a bus here and you went downtown, and then you got on a bus to go to Greece or wherever you were gonna go. Now, our GRTA is now looking at doing a spoke system around so that you can go from town to town to town to town. Those are things we have to take into consideration now too. It's a different animal than it was before.
Parking for the Penfield's code. Does it give allowance or to the discretion of the planning board to reduce parking?
It does.
Based on the presented actual need by the
It does,
by the
yes.
applicant.
Yeah. And the planning board is big on land banking parking, so in the event that you put in use A that doesn't need a lot of people but needs a big building for one reason or another.
And that's big because before, codes generally tended to be pretty rigid, saying retail 1 to 200
Right.
square feet, no matter what.
Right.
Otherwise, you go to zoning board of appeal.
The
if
big
you
problem
can-
isn't so much the
but if
first
you
time
can-
users, because
But
they
if
know
you
what they
can
need.
streamline the process and use common sense, and then grant a site plan approval based on a reduced
Yeah.
actual need as proven,
Yeah,
then that's
We've land banked a lot of properties. The big problem that you run into
part of
is
your
not so much
master
the first
plan,
person.
knows to make, offer that guided direction.
It's already in our code.
Yeah.
The big problem you run into is not so much the first-time users, because they have 50 people and they're gonna use 50 parking spaces or 60 parking spaces, and they're good with it even though the site could use 120. We just land bank the rest of it until such time as the next user coming in who now needs that
If they have the
120.
space, if they have the space for land.
If they have the
banking.
space to do it.
Right.
Then you gotta be
They
careful.
show it too,
Yeah.
where it's gonna be.
Yeah.
So, second point.
Yes, yeah, we're doing a good job jumping around people's comments.
So, at some point, I feel like we need to have a discussion about the economic impact of all this stuff. You know, everyone, myself included, wants more parks, wants more trails, wants more playgrounds and recreation and all that stuff. All that stuff that generates nothing in revenue. And nobody, myself included, wants these massive apartment complexes that do generate revenue. So, no one stood up and said, can you please raise my taxes by 25% next year?
Yeah, we heard anybody
How do
say
we
that.
pay for all this stuff? You know, what's the economic impact of making these decisions?
You've talked about it the whole time, how this town's been built out and
It's a bedroom community. I mean, 92% of the town is zoned residential or multi-residential. We have more parkland, acres of parkland in this town than we do commercial property. The commercial property is what drives the tax structure so that you don't have to get stuck having to pay for all that stuff. That was one of the reasons why we developed a mixed-use district, because it wasn't only single-family or multi-residential. It had to have commercial components in it, but they had to be scaled to accommodate the new neighborhood. We're not looking for any more big box development. If there's redevelopment of Baytown Plaza or, Wegmans Plazas or something like that, you can accommodate that there. But to go out and just take up more land and put in another big box on these properties, we didn't want to do that in the last comp plan.
and pretty much
So-
every piece of zoned commercial land is built on.
They're pretty much built on. There are very, very few pieces left that
They're not big.
are just virgin area that have not been built on. Very few.
Or they're waiting to be converted, like in our BNR districts where they exist as single-family homes today.
Right.
And the vision from the 2010 plan was, all right, let's rezone these to business non-retail to do your 9 to 5 professional office buildings when the property is ready to be redeveloped. And we talked about that early on in the process out by 25440, the Penfield Road Wegmans, how we have those new businesses out there for the eye doctor, dentist.
And even
So
those
on
are
and so
difficult
forth.
because you're basically taking 100 by 200 foot lots,
Yeah.
and now you're converting what was a 1,200 or 1,400 square foot home into a building that's, needs parking, it needs access between the properties. We're granting variances like crazy on them, but we have to do it because you can
We're
never
trying
fit
to
all
be
the things in
flexible
there.
for that commercial
That's why you're seeing the
development.
buildings coming closer to the roads now, so we
envision.
can get the parking and access to the rear of the properties. And, it's a battle every time, and reduce curb cuts.
That balance is kind of looking at what lands we have now and what lands in those areas could offer a good transitional use between your intense general business districts and something like a limited business, a BNR, or, townhomes, MR, those things, apartments that they don't have to be 7 stories tall, but they do generate more tax revenue than your standard single-family home. So it's kind of things you have to look at as you kind of start taking that big, broad look at the town and start narrowing in on pieces of certain areas and say, what do we see there?
Well, I think to your point, if we're going to make recommendations for increased recreation, we have to make recommendations for how we can,
How do you offset that?
how we offset that within the tax base. Yeah, I mean, you can't leave a pipe dream, there has to be both sides, yeah.
Well, and I think it's important, and I know that, I raised this once before, and I realize that there are limits to what we can do, but in terms of nonprofit groups coming in, taking, for example, building senior housing if they're associated with the Episcopal Church or some other sort of thing, versus for-profit
Right.
taxable entities. And I don't know how we manage that situation, but, we can't be, we kind of can't really be a town that's got nothing but nonprofits,
Right.
filling it up, and, you have medical, the medical facilities and stuff like that.
Exactly.
We all like to be able to go to urgent care if we need it, but how many medical facilities do we have to have, or can we accommodate when they're not generating any tax revenue in the town?
That's a good point. And those are all the things you have to take into account. And the problem that you run into really is with the non-for-profits. A lot of them are they're medical, just as you noted, they're religious. You really can't block religion.
Can't
from-
say no to a lot of these
You
people.
can't say no. Now luckily, it's funny you brought that up because I was just talking to the assessor the other day, because I am concerned about the number of not-for-profit properties that are going off the. She indicated to me though that it's not as bad as you might think it is in this town compared to some of the other towns. Some of the other towns are having much higher problems than we are. We kind of got lucky in one respect with the YMCA being where it is. It's a not-for-profit organization, and they brought in medical to that site, which is URMC Medical. So at first I thought that's probably not an appropriate thing to do, but now as I look at it, at least URMC didn't take another piece of property off the tax rolls, and they're utilizing what's already off the tax rolls. So they're partnering up now, which is a good thing. And even at the commercial now, the churches own like Browncroft Corners Plaza. But if they lease out spaces in that plaza for retail or restaurant use, those are not exempt from the tax structure. It's just the areas that they are utilizing for religious purposes. So, and again, you know, religion serves a great purpose in everybody's society. I mean, they do a lot of great things for a lot of people, and certainly they've done a lot for this community in terms of how they help people.
And medical will continue to be a growing need because they don't want to send everyone to the hospital and to the ER for
Well, and
every
again,
little thing.
Oh, they still do.
Penfield,
I know they do.
Penfield has a
I know
very high
they do.
aging population.
But
Don't worry.
they
you
try to
guys need
get-
go outside our front door because we pull up to the back door.
If you don't grow up here like Heidi did, if you move here at the age of 32 or 33, and you have your children, because you've got a good school district, you've got great recreation, you've got a nice community, and then you turn out to be 65 like me, 30 years later.
Now what?
Well, you know, hopefully if you're healthy, you stay, but if you're not, but then you've got the need for medical, you've got the need for housing, all these things come into play now, and now with all the baby boomers starting to get to that point where they're at the big bubble,
They want to kick you out of your house. so
you're
you can
gonna
have it.
you're gonna see that now for the next 10 or 15 years before that group fades away, and then this other group starts coming up now, the millennials becoming 60-year-olds instead of 30-year-olds. So it's just an ongoing cycle that you have to address every few years.
What else you guys got?
I got a couple more here. Someone mentioned community choice aggregation in terms of utilities, considering that, and I think under that, we had talked about, in other words, just slipping my mind, kind of technology, infrastructure type stuff.
Yeah.
So green light, community
I'm
choice,
still for it.
stuff like
They're
that.
building, don't worry.
Still worse.
That just that be something that we consider, you know, as
Absolutely.
as a committee,
Yeah.
that it wasn't really a big piece
Yeah,
of
and
the
that falls
other
under the
plan.
sustainability section that we're all,
Yep,
Yeah,
and somebody
yeah.
actually brought that up during the conversation as having a sustainability. I thought that was interesting,
Yep.
that somebody else thought that was a
Yeah,
area for focus.
absolutely.
and I think also in sustainability, a couple of people brought up stuff about use of herbicides, pesticides, things
Right.
like that, not just on town properties where I know there's a reduction
Right,
process going
the
on.
towns are heavily regulated. As a matter of
Yeah.
fact, we used to see it in the ponds, we used to put the blue outside.
Yeah.
Can't even do that anymore.
But there,
We're held to a much higher standard
Much
than your
higher.
average homeowner.
I know, but I think what people were leaning toward is, can we enforce a higher standard in, you know, residential? Is there something we can do
The
to
county
encourage that?
the county actually has a good program where they try to educate people about this, and I'll try and get some information for the
Okay.
group on this. It's been a tough haul, as you can imagine, because everybody wants a perfect lawn and nobody wants dandelions in their lawn. So, I mean, they've got some ideas though about how to minimize the impact and the types of uses and the amount of uses that they have of different types of herbicides, and they try to get away from the nitrates, they try to get away from the phosphorus. And there are other things that they're using now that help do that. And it's a community education program. The county's been trying to do it with the H2O Water Hero about not pouring stuff into sewers. People, I can't tell you how many people I've seen pour stuff into sewers. It amazes me.
That's meant for rainwater, that's about it.
But they don't understand where that's going and what's happening when it gets to where it's going. I mean, everybody who works for the towns, they all know, we're working with the county on a regular basis to mitigate. It's not just the county, it's the DEC, it's the EPA, everybody's working to minimize impacts to water, water quality, making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's gotten much better than it used to be. I remember the developers never, I mean, everything just ran down the streets, they ran down into people's backyards. Now they're responsible for making sure that there's erosion control everywhere on their properties. They have to seed quicker than they used to have to.
Concrete
And they're held to a
washouts,
higher
that kind of
standard, and
stuff.
if they don't do it, the fines are outrageous. Fines are 37,500 a day, a day. We've had one developer that got hit for that for a day. And it was kind of unfortunate. It wasn't his fault that it occurred, but he was responsible, so we had to take care of it.
To your point, Don, I think one thing on that topic though, when you think about the purpose of a comprehensive plan for a 10-year goal of a town, I just encourage you to everyone to think about how does that fit in to it. It could be like a small line item under sustainability. Is it a whole chapter in itself? No.
But
But it's,
I see it as part of the sustainability thing.
You
that
might hang
was
on to
not
it,
in the
but
prior one.
you have to realize too, again, it's like, it's an education piece, but a lot of it comes down to the homeowner, and it is tough to change people.
You can do it,
Is what
though.
it
I mean,
comes down to.
education can do it, and legislation can do it as well. I mean, if you're put in a position where you're violating code by doing something you're not supposed
That's
to.
an extreme though. I mean, when you're just talking about,
That's why you have codes, because for
If you're
every one
preventing-
person
if
that
you're
did it
trying
right,
to- if you're
for every 10 people that did it right,
if
one
you're
person
trying to
wants
prevent
do it
people
wrong.
from using the 1, 2, 3, 4-step process you buy at Home Depot every year, then good luck.
But even those products now are not
That's
what they
true.
used to be.
Yeah, and those are evolving in themselves. That's a good
They have
point.
been reduced down, so they're minimized.
Right.
Yeah.
What, Harold?
But they're all reducing what they put into the.
They are.
Yeah.
They're all watered down now.
Yeah, they
It's kind of
are.
like happening
You're not paying for what you
as we
paid
go
for in the
along. I
60s
think that's
and
kind of where my
70s.
point was going, I think. Maybe, I hope so. Who knows what my brain's thinking at this point.
But education plays a big role, and certainly the comp plan could be a conduit for that education.
Agreed.
All right, so I have a question for the group outside of all of this. We're proposing the next meeting be on the 22nd. Any conflicts with that?
Okay.
Because right now, we're scheduled for the 11th to be the last day for public comments to come in. And we don't want to wrap them up on a Friday and try to get them to you that day, which I don't think we could physically do actually. And then give you 4 days to review them before we meet again on the 15th, which we originally
Tuesday,
thought of. So, looking at the 22nd, it gives everyone enough time for us to process the comments that come in and get those to you with enough time to digest them before we're actually talking about them back at this table. Are we good for the 22nd?
So far, yeah.
All right, and we're gonna push out another round of social media out regarding the public comments that are open on the webpage. If you know anyone that's interested in this project, has questions, has recommendations, please encourage them to use that as their method of submitting those comments. It works great, and it comes out as a great formatted tool for you to review that. It's real clean content to read. And again, we'll push that out again on our social media side of things to just spread the word one last time before the 11th shows up. Come back here and then start talking about a lot of the things Jim brought up.
And we'll start going through the town again, step by step,
Yep.
just to make sure you're all comfortable with various areas, so there's no question as to what we want to
I
do.
think what will help too is if we go also step by step, but maybe region by region.
Yep, that's what I thought too.
You know, like the east side
Yep,
or whatever, and then
the east side.
the west side,
Yep,
Empire Boulevard,
exactly.
progress it that way.
Yep,
and
I
then
think so too.
start-
Yeah, we can go kind of use it like take a regional approach to it.
That's what I'm,
Yeah.
Yep.
yeah, because I think a lot of the issues are, so to speak, regional. And then, you know, go down from there. Maybe think about it that way.
I like that
Yeah, and I
idea.
was
We have so
looking
many
at-
mapping tools available to make that possible.
And even, and going back to the east side's important too, because I was just thinking about the fact, looking at Bob Peterson's list, one thing he didn't have on it, and he probably doesn't even know about it, but we did pick up some land on Route 250 from the Amish family. They gave us about 18 to 20 acres on the west side of Route 250, just about in the Allen Road
Right across
area.
from Allen Road.
And that is now considered to be a park or open space area.
It is.
So we've got to incorporate that into the inventory
okay.
as well. It's a nice piece of property.
Lots of poison ivy.
Been out
We're,
there?
we're aware of that.
Yeah, the highway department concurs with your thought.
As long as it doesn't have that, whatever that weed is that looks like Queen Anne's
Hogweed.
lace.
Hogweed.
Hogweed.
Oh, yeah.
Not that we know of.
So when we talk to like property owners, are we calling them and having them come back? Are we calling, you guys calling them?
That's us. That's us.
That's
to
your
bring-
guys.
That's
That's our-
us to bring them to the table.
Yeah, that's our responsibility.
I know, remember Dave Woodard and Schutz, they were talking about rezoning options to maintain that open space, just options for them. Like that the fact that their current zoning kind of handcuffs them. I think it was more, Schutz was kind of talking about that. But there's a whole lot of talk about
conservation
space. What's that?
His conservation easement?
Yeah, just different things, you know, I mean, farming isn't what it used to be.
No.
And what they can and cannot do, you know,
Like, as you know, that conservation easements has a whole other layer of legalities to it other than just zoning.
Yeah, but we also talked about
Well, we
the
could probably
possibility of
write a book
making a
about the pros
recommendation
and
that
cons
maybe
of
those are
conservation easements, right?
re-examined
yes,
under the current.
from one
current
generation to the
situation,
next.
That's
yeah.
right.
I remember.
Be renegotiated.
Yeah, because I think times have changed enough in 10 years that maybe we want to,
As a town, take a look at what those were and maybe adjust those restrictions so that people can have a livelihood with the property, you know.
I think that's a very good recommendation to look into.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, I mean, it's
How do you
nice-
change it without going out to a vote to the public?
Yeah, you're right, because
We voted-
remember, there
we
was
voted to
there were
do it.
$10 million involved in that, and that went out as a referendum as well, so that's difficult.
Purchasing.
But again, everybody thought it was pie in the sky to do this, oh, we'll make this family wealthy by taking away the development rights. Well, you made the owner wealthy, who then passes away, and now his kids and his grandkids have this property, and they don't have the money, and the property's sitting there, and nobody can do anything with it. And if you've got a Dave Woodward, thank God for him, that's willing to go out and farm it and help pay your taxes and everything else on it, that's great. But if there's nobody out there, and the property's just sitting there, and you can't do anything with it, but you still gotta pay your taxes on it, not a good situation. So,
Is there a zoning category here in our community? I'm familiar with this from New Hampshire. My husband's family for years has had an old farm, and it hasn't been farmed the whole time it's been in their family. And it's called current use is the status. So it was back, probably 80 years ago or something. If you were, in order to encourage people to maintain large pieces of property, whether they were actively farmed or for whatever reason they're just big, you've got a reduction in your property taxes for keeping the property in one chunk. And if ever you were to sell the property, you could sell the property in one chunk, that's fine too. But if you were to try to subdivide it, then you owed back taxes. And I don't think you owed them back.
Kind of like an ag district.
that, I was just thinking the same thing, it's like if you're in the
Yeah.
ag, if you had the big parcel and it was
Yeah.
a farm and they were getting an agricultural exemption,
Yeah.
Okay.
the problem is it probably wasn't the case like in your husband's property, because you have to generate so much income off the property per year in order to be eligible for one.
Yeah, this wasn't.
So, and again, the big thing is sometimes subdividing property is a kiss of death for you if you don't sell the property quickly, because if you split them, they now have new value to them that they didn't have before, and
And
you're
that's where
paying
your
higher
back
taxes
taxes
on
come
it.
from.
Right, and that's what I was.
It doesn't help you, it hurts you, so.
Yeah.
So you're kind of, if you've got people that want to develop it, it's great, but if you don't,
Our zoning doesn't currently talk like
it
that.
doesn't
Okay.
encourage you to
Yeah, I
do
just
it,
wondered,
yeah.
yeah.
I think that's something that's probably hung on from the past. And you just had enough people saying, oh, we'll never change it, help us. And we've never taken that approach. Our code now is based off the one that was written in '81, and it continues to live on, and we keep trying to improve it as we go along, and it's currently not written that way.
Yeah, I just wondered.
And again, the big thing in subdividing is you're going to be on septic system out there, so you're not going to have small lots. And that's fine. I mean, if you want to have a 2-acre, or 5-acre, or 10-acre lot, there's nothing wrong with
Plenty
that.
of people that want it.
You know, it's better than just turning the whole thing into a half-acre subdivision and everybody's got their half-acre lot and there's no open space left. But, without the sanitary sewers, you're really in a constraining situation in terms of selling off property. The nice thing out there is that you've had somebody like Dave Woodward who's been farming those lands and helping people pay their taxes over the years. By doing that, you know, there's gonna come a point in time when Dave's not gonna do it anymore, and then all of a sudden people are gonna be thinking just like that, maybe we should start splitting the property off, but
Sometimes it's for good use to say, let's keep it in the family, but let's have everyone have their own thing.
it's difficult. I mean, it's tough when you own a lot of property.
Might be shaking her.
Thank God for the agricultural exemption, though, that does have families that have active agriculture on their property.
You just need Dave.
You need Dave.
Need a clone, Dave, it sounds
Yeah.
like.
We'll start calling it the Dave exemption.
Yeah, right? Just want to make sure that, you know.
Dave keeps a
can
low profile, but he's
can you
very,
do
very
things?
integral to this community.
Has anybody got a license to start growing hemp yet?
Let's
No,
do it.
not
Tell you
yet.
what.
Not yet.
Not yet here.
No. That's a whole different world. And that's something you might see happen over the next 10 years, you know? And that might save agricultural in this town, you know?
Oh,
If you can generate that kind of an income for it.
Hemp, hops?
Pretty sure you won't see Dave doing that.
No,
No,
I'm
I don't think you will.
pretty certain Dave won't be the guy doing
I see
it.
they'll have a giant greenhouse go up like the one in Webster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The tomato.
Sure, tomato, sure, for now.
See the
Yeah, what's it gonna be in 5 years from now?
telephone pole
Different kind of sauce.
forest go
Yeah.
up,
Well,
perhaps.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, they gotta grow up.
So if there's nothing left for tonight, folks, I think it's a good meeting to kind of go back and revisit the public information meeting. We'll keep collecting public comments. We encourage you to, you know, again, if you know anyone who's eager to voice their thought, do it that way. Get it through the website and get it to us. And we'll kind of,
Zach, will there be another public meeting like that, or is that like a one and done?
No, I think what'll happen next is we'll start preparing a document, a draft document.
based on our next few meetings.
And then go through the draft document with the public if you want and see what their reaction is to it.
Did you do that like by section versus, I mean, just kind of,
Well, we would put the document out on the website and let the public review it and then bring their comments to you. So
Call it like a 90% document,
Yeah.
and we put that out to the public for a public hearing. And then we kind of take those comments and bring it back here, and then we
fine
work
tune
towards
the
the
final, the
final.
document and get it to where it
And
needs to be.
We start our seeker process, and
But I think we need to finish up what you want to do with the various sections of town.
yep.
And then start thinking about the topics that we want to create now for the updated plan. See what we want to keep from 2010, see what we want to add on for 2020.
Agree.
And don't forget Donna's comments here. Actually,
I can just
Oh, yeah.
take
did
one.
you
I can
grab one?
scan them if you
Zach,
want.
did you grab one?
Yeah, I mean, they're not my comments, I wrote the name down of each speaker.
That's okay.
And tried to make bullet points of what
That's fine.
each speaker said,
I
so.
was doing the same thing the whole
Well, I
time.
figured you were, so I
nice shot,
thought.
Donna.
And I knew you two would do it, so I did.
I saw that, I'm very
Yeah,
used to
But
it.
I can always go back and watch the tape too.
Okay,
All right.
Thank you all very
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Be careful on the way home. I don't know if it's still raining or not. but
probably this one.